This is Unreal Engine 5. 3 weeks ago, I set out to finally learn Unreal. It started out great. I was following tutorials and making progress on my character model. Then, I learned the basics of importing assets and textures, and even made a little pool rooms environment. I felt super accomplished at the end of the second week and was ready to set out and start making a proper video game. Little did I know this would be my first visit to tutorial hell. In my last video, I mentioned that I wanted to make some improvements to my character's sounds, adding a breathing sound effect to my character's sprint, as well as some clothing chafing. This was actually the first goal I set out to do, and I immediately was hit with a brick wall. You see, up until this point, almost everything I had done in this engine was from a tutorial. But when I looked up how to add a breathing effect to my character model, there were very few options, and the ones that were there were different from how I wanted to implement my effect. I wanted my character to be breathing normally when they're walking, and when they start sprinting, I want them to start breathing heavier. But these tutorials were either explaining how to give a mesh a breathing effect, or how to add a visible breath to your character. Some of them were close to what I needed, like in this tutorial. They add a sound for their sprint, but their normal breathing faded away after 20 seconds. I figured I would watch it anyway, and maybe by the end I would understand enough to program the differences by myself. When I tried doing that, I would end up making my character bug out, like when I thought it was a good idea to have my sprint sound effect connect to my event tick, causing the sound to loop infinitely. And if I wasn't doing that, then the sound wouldn't play at all. I figured I would cut my losses and move on to the next tutorial. But when I scrolled down, it was just a void of unrelated videos. I had watched every breathing tutorial there was, or at least all the breathing tutorials YouTube would show me. I hit Google asking how I could make a sound effect fade on in Unreal Engine. Google's AI spit out an answer making it seem so easy, but when I tried replicating that, it didn't work either. I couldn't even find what it was telling me to use. By this point, I was feeling severely unconfident in my abilities. I mean, I had just released 2 updates showing off all this progression, and now here I am, not even able to fade on my sprint effect. I spent 2 days in this state, and I figured if I was gonna get this done, I was gonna have to learn the fundamentals. So that's what I did for the next few days. I watched videos that you guys recommended, videos explaining blueprint fundamentals and all the basic functions they all do. I watched hours and hours of this stuff, up late into the night fueled by energy drinks. This was definitely beneficial as it helped me understand referencing information, but I still felt as though I wasn't understanding what I needed to do. I then turned my attention to learning the logic around sounds. My issue with this was there was very few tutorials for sound design. Most of them seemed to cover attenuation, but I already understood attenuation when I set up my footsteps, so most of these weren't going to be useful to me. The ones that were left were adding sounds into a scene, or were full-on courses, so I figured I would try one of these free beginner courses. I watched it and understood most of the video, but I still didn't understand enough to get the sounds to do what I want. If you're familiar with Unreal, I know you're laughing at how easy of a function this is to pull off, but it's important to remember just how unintuitive game dev can be, especially to a dev who's coming from a previous engine. You see, I used to develop on Dreams before this, and Dreams also has a visual scripting language, much like Blueprint in Unreal Engine, with similar component names too. Unreal has timelines and keyframes, Dreams has timelines and keyframes, but they work very differently in both engines. In Dreams, you can program a keyframe to change anything in the game, as well as a built-in fade-on system. So programming this breathing effect in Dreams would have been as simple as connecting the L3 button to a selector, which is similar to a flip-flop. But when I tried recreating that system in Unreal, the sounds just looped into infinity, leaving me feeling frustrated. So frustrated that I practically spent the next day playing Left 4 Dead 2 instead of developing. After that wonderful hiatus, it was back to learning sound components. But this time I would try to not get too deep in learning all the fundamentals, and I would try finding tutorials that were more specific to my needs. The reason is, I feel that's where a lot of tutorial hell stems from. Like, how many times have you sat through a tutorial series, followed all of it to a T, and even completed the project, but when it's time to sit down and actually program a game, you have forgotten 90% of the tutorials you watched, and end up having to go back and rewatch them. If you're anything like me, this happens a lot, and frankly is not what I want to go through with this engine. I searched up the available sound tutorials, and most of them seemed either long as hell or were unrelated, until I stumbled upon this video. This video was covering how to fade on a sound component with a trigger zone. While this was different than what I was doing, it was the first tutorial I had seen mention the fade on component that Google's AI mentioned earlier. I watched the video, and rather than trying to recreate the logic, I just tried to understand it. I saw the way the fade on component needs the audio to be referenced so it knows what sound it's applied to. The way you can use a delay to have a sound fade on and off from the same signal, and that's when it clicked. I finally understood at least some of the components. First, a signal from my begin play would go out and tell 4 sounds to start playing. A body cam sound effect, my normal breathing sound effect, my sprinting breathing sound effect, and my clothing chafing sound effect. The last 2 then immediately get told to fade off. Then, when my character starts sprinting and their walk speed gets reset, a signal goes and fades off my normal breathing, then fades on my sprint breathing and chafing sounds. Then when they release sprint, the opposite happens, and it fades the original sounds back on. Sure, the logic may not be the prettiest, but it actually works. Though I keep getting this error whenever I playtest it, but it's working perfectly fine, so I don't know why I'm getting this error. Either way, this was still a huge moment for me. This was practically my first original code that I set up that wasn't straight out of a tutorial, and with the code functioning correctly, I went on to add more. This time I wanted to add a jump impact, and without a tutorial, I grabbed my crouch animation, attached it to my jump, then added that to the landing impact signal, and this ended up working great too, and I felt so relieved to have something work after struggling for 5 days. I was so excited I immediately hopped on stream to share my new progress. I was so happy and decided in celebration I would reward myself with some level design. For the past few weeks, I have been cooking up what I want this game to be. I like the idea of a horror game where you play a cop who gets lost in an alternate dimension filled with liminal spaces and otherworldly beings.
So just a cop in the back rooms?
Yes, but with more of a focus on story. So my first move was downloading a cop car. There wasn't too many options, but I eventually got recommended this model from a chatter. This model was honestly great, though it had a few issues. First being the interior seemed unfinished, and the second being with its mesh causing some weird issues with my depth of field. But it was good enough for me. Then I worked on importing a gravel texture and downloading this asset pack from the store. This was by far the most fun thing I had done in this engine by this point, and immediately set out to make a parking lot. This parking lot would be in a rundown town, so I set out rubble, trash, buildings, and slowly formed the environment. I probably worked till 3 AM on this. This was just when I stopped recording. I got on the next day and kept working on the scene with chat, and together we made this. There's definitely some issues I'm gonna have to figure out, but this was still way more detailed than my environment last week. I couldn't figure out how to implement this dumpster's graffiti texture, as I didn't know how to combine 2 color textures for one node. I also couldn't quite figure out how to use the power lines in this asset pack. But my biggest L was I couldn't figure out how to add depth to this gravel. It looks nice, but way too flat. But that'll just have to be things I learn later on. As my next goal is I would like to make a tutorial for the game. I have it planned out in my head, but now I'll have to work on bringing it to the level. And if you're interested in seeing that early, or even offer suggestions that could end up in the final game, stop by my Twitch. You guys are always so helpful, and I love hearing from you guys when I'm developing. And I want to thank you if you got this far. And do comment down below if you have any comments, questions, or critiques. You guys had so many suggestions in the last video, and the support from this community is unreal. Alright. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'll see y'all on the next Unreal update.